Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. My name is Carl Mercer, and this happened to me back in 2008. I was a junior in college at the time, trying to balance a full course load while working nights at a local diner in Laramie, Wyoming. Life was pretty straightforward, though not without its share of struggles. Between classes, work, and an ongoing feud with my roommate over his terrible taste in music, I had a lot on my plate. I figured I was just your average, everyday college kid trying to make it through. One night, after a particularly rough shift, I decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. The fresh air helped clear my head, and the quiet was a nice change from the constant clatter of the diner. Laramie isn't a big town, but it's got its share of dark corners and quiet streets, especially at night. About halfway home, I took a shortcut through an alley behind a row of old warehouses. The area was mostly abandoned, just a few businesses still operating during the day. At night, it was dead quiet. It wasn't the first time I'd taken this route. It shaved a good 12 minutes off my walk. But this night felt different. The air was heavy, and the only sound was the distant hum of a generator somewhere far off. As I made my way down the alley, I noticed something strange. A thick, metallic smell hung in the air, like rust and old blood. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just some leaking pipe or something. But then, about halfway through the alley, I tripped over something. I looked down and saw a torn piece of fabric, dark and stained. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just trash, part of the usual urban decay. Just as I was about to continue on, I heard a faint noise. It sounded like a groan, low and pained. I froze, straining to hear more. The groan came again, more distinct this time, from behind one of the dumpsters up ahead. I took a few hesitant steps forward, squinting into the darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I could make out a shape slumped against the brick wall. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response, just another groan, weaker this time. Against my better judgment, I approached. What I saw made my stomach turn. A man, maybe in his mid-30s, was sprawled on the ground, his clothes torn and stained with blood. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises, one eye swollen shut. He looked like he'd been mauled by some kind of animal. "Holy," I muttered, kneeling beside him. "Hey, can you hear me?" He tried to speak, but only a ragged breath escaped his lips. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The operator picked up, and I gave them my location, explaining as best I could what had happened. "An ambulance is on its way," the operator assured me. "Stay with him if you can, but don't move him." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Got it." As I waited, I glanced around the alley, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow and sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to jump out at us. It felt like an eternity before I heard the distant wail of sirens. The paramedics arrived, and I stepped back to let them work. They loaded the man onto a stretcher, still unconscious, and hurried him into the ambulance. One of the paramedics, A woman with a no-nonsense demeanor asked me a few questions before they took off, leaving me alone in the alley. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced with questions. Who was that guy? What had happened to him? And more importantly, what kind of animal could do that to a person? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the incident. I asked around at the diner and among my friends, but no one had heard anything. It was like the whole thing had been a bad dream, except for the blood-stained alley and the memory of that man's battered face. About a week later, I got a call from the Laramie Police Department. They wanted to ask me some questions about what I had seen. I agreed, hoping they might have some answers for me. The detective I spoke with, a grizzled guy named Tom Strickland, had a demeanor that screamed, "I've seen it all." "Mr. Mercer," he began, flipping open a worn notebook, "we appreciate you coming in. We're trying to piece together what happened to Mr. Alan Hewitt, the man you found. Do you have any idea what did that to him?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Strickland sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're still investigating. The injuries, they don't match any animal attacks we're familiar with. And there's no indication of a weapon being used, at least not a conventional one." "What does that mean?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "It means we don't know yet," he replied, his tone a bit sharper. "We were hoping you might have seen or heard something that could help." I recounted everything again, from the metallic smell to the groans and the blood-stained fabric. Strickland took notes, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained unreadable. "We'll be in touch if we have any more questions," he said finally, standing up to signal the end of our meeting. As I walked out of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't telling me everything. There was something in Strickland's eyes, a hint of unease that didn't match his gruff exterior. Life went on, as it tends to do, but I couldn't shake the incident from my mind. I started taking different routes home, avoiding the alley altogether. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers about strange sightings around town, people seeing shadows moving in the night, hearing eerie noises that didn't quite make sense, but nothing concrete, nothing I could pin down. Then, about a month later, I ran into an old friend, Max Collins, at the diner. Max and I had gone to high school together, but we'd lost touch after graduation. He was a big guy, the kind who seemed like he could handle himself in a fight, but he looked more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "Carl, man, you got a minute?" he asked, glancing around like he was afraid of being overheard. "Sure, Max. What's up?" I said, motioning for him to sit down. He slid into the booth, lowering his voice. "You hear about the weird stuff going on around here lately?" I nodded. "Bits and pieces. Why?" Max leaned in closer. "I've seen something, man. Something I can't explain." My curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "It was a couple nights ago," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was out by the old railroad tracks, you know, where the woods start getting thick. I heard something moving in the trees, figured it was just a deer or something. But then I saw it. This thing. It was huge, on all fours, but not like any animal I've ever seen. Its eyes, Carl. They were like burning coals. A chill ran down my spine." "You sure it wasn't just a bear or something?" Max shook his head vehemently. "No way, man. This thing was different. It had this presence, like it knew I was there, like it was watching me. I didn't know what to say. Max wasn't the type to scare easily, and the fear in his eyes was real. "Did you tell anyone else?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just you. People would think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw." We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of his words hanging between us. Finally, I broke the silence. "Thanks for telling me, Max. Just be careful, all right?" He nodded, standing up to leave. "You too, Carl. Something's not right in this town." After that conversation, I started to pay more attention to the rumors, to the stories people whispered when they thought no one was listening. And the more I listened, the more I realized that Max wasn't alone. There were others who had seen things, heard things, but they were too scared to speak up. One night, as I was closing up the diner, I heard a noise outside. It was a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but deeper, more menacing. My heart raced, and I grabbed a kitchen knife, the closest thing to a weapon I could find. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face. The street was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, and then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness, unblinking, almost curious. The creature was huge, covered in matted fur, its body hunched and muscular. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, a nightmare made flesh. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I knew I had to get inside, but my legs felt like lead. The creature took a step forward, its eyes never leaving mine, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the night. I stood there shaking, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. I knew I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? Max, maybe, but that was it. Everyone else would think I was crazy. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the memory of those eyes haunted me. I started carrying the knife with me everywhere, a small comfort in the face of the unknown. Then one evening, as I was getting ready for my shift, I got a call from Detective Strickland. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice grim, "we need you to come down to the station. It's about Mr. Hewitt." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Is he okay?" There was a pause. "Just come down. We'll explain everything." I arrived at the station, my mind racing with possibilities. Strickland met me at the door, his expression as serious as ever. "Follow me," he said, leading me to a small interrogation room. Inside there were photos spread out on the table, photos of Alan Hewitt. But not just of him. There were others too, people I didn't recognize, all with the same horrific injuries. "We've been looking into similar cases," Strickland explained, gesturing to the photos. "There's a pattern here, something we can't ignore." I glanced at the images, my stomach churning. "What do you think is doing this?" Strickland shook his head. "We're not sure. But whatever it is, it's not human." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who's come forward," he replied, "and we need your help." Over the next few weeks, I worked with the police, sharing everything I knew, everything I'd heard. We pieced together a rough map of the sightings, trying to find a pattern. But it was like chasing a ghost. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to move at random, striking without warning. One night, I got a call from Max. His voice was frantic, barely coherent. "Carl, it's here. It's outside my house." My blood ran cold. "Stay inside, Max. I'm calling the cops." I dialed 911, explaining the situation as best I could. Then I grabbed the knife and ran out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Max lived on the edge of town, near the woods. As I approached his house, I saw the lights on, the front door ajar. I burst inside, calling his name. "Max, where are you?" No answer. I moved through the house, my grip tightening on the knife. The living room was empty, as was the kitchen. But then I heard a noise from the backyard, a low, rumbling sound that made my blood run cold. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the darkness, and then I saw it. The creature was standing over Max's lifeless body, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I felt a surge of rage and fear, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. The creature looked up, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment we just stared at each other, a silent challenge hanging between us. And then it lunged. I swung the knife, catching it across the shoulder. It let out a roar of pain, staggering back. I took the opportunity to run, my legs finally obeying. I didn't stop until I reached the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cops arrived a few minutes later, their sirens blaring. I pointed them towards the backyard, unable to form coherent words. They moved in, guns drawn, but by then the creature was gone, leaving only Max's body and a trail of blood. In the aftermath, the town was in an uproar. People demanded answers, but there were none to give. The police increased their patrols, and for a while the sightings stopped. But the fear lingered, a shadow over Laramie that no one could shake. As for me, I moved away, transferring to a college in another state. I never told anyone what really happened, not even my closest friends. But every now and then I'd hear a story, a rumor, of strange sightings in the night. And I'd remember those glowing eyes, the feeling of being watched. It's been years since that night, but I still carry the knife with me, a small comfort in a world that no longer feels as safe as it once did. I don't know what that creature was or why it chose Laramie, but I do know one thing. Some things are better left in the dark, where they belong. The creature of the Smokies. I never thought I'd find myself crawling through the dense underbrush of the Great Smoky Mountains, but here I was, in the year 1996, doing just that. My name is Miles Hayden, and I've always been a straightforward guy, a structural engineer no less, with a love for hiking on weekends. Life had been pretty routine up until this particular trip. Routine but good. I worked hard, kept to myself mostly, and enjoyed the simple pleasures. A cold beer after a long day, a good book on a rainy evening, and of course the solitude of the mountains. This trip wasn't supposed to be any different. Just a weekend getaway with my old college buddy, Andy Mard. Andy's the kind of guy who talks a lot but says little. He's a lawyer now, working the kind of hours that would kill a lesser man. But Andy lives for the challenge, always chasing something, though I'm not sure he knows what. He'd asked me to come out to the mountains, just the two of us, like old times, and I figured, why not? Life could use a little spice, even if it was just the two of us pretending to be adventurous. The day started off easy enough. The trail we chose wasn't well trodden, just the way I liked it. We hadn't seen another soul since we left the parking lot, and by midday we were deep into the woods. The canopy above was thick, blocking out the sun and casting everything in a kind of twilight. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. It was quiet, too, unnaturally so, which should have tipped me off, but it didn't. Around noon we stopped for a break near a small stream. The water was crystal clear, and I remember feeling a strange sense of calm watching it flow over the rocks. Andy was rummaging through his pack for something, probably one of the fancy energy bars he always carried. I was just about to take a drink from my canteen when I noticed the first sign that something was off. A footprint. It was large, too large for any human, and oddly shaped. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, but something else entirely. "Hey, Andy," I called out, my voice betraying a hint of unease. "Come take a look at this." He sauntered over, chewing on his bar, and crouched down beside me. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, poking at the print with a stick. "Damn if I know," I replied, feeling a knot form in my gut. "But whatever it is, it's big." Andy shrugged it off, more curious than concerned. "Probably just a bear," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Come on, let's keep moving." We pressed on, but that footprint stuck with me. As we ventured deeper, the terrain grew rougher, the trees more twisted, their gnarled roots clawing at the earth. The trail was barely visible now, more of a suggestion than a path. We came across more footprints, each one more disturbing than the last. They seemed to be following us, or maybe we were following them. It was hard to tell. It wasn't until late afternoon that we stumbled upon the cabin. It sat nestled in a small clearing, half hidden by the overgrown brush. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging under years of neglect. There were no windows, just a single door hanging slightly ajar. Andy, ever the curious one, headed straight for it. "Looks like someone's been living off the grid," he said, pushing the door open with a creak. "Or something," I muttered under my breath, following him inside. The interior was as bleak as the exterior, with little more than a table, a couple of chairs, and a rusty wood stove. The walls were lined with shelves, but they were mostly bare, save for a few dusty jars of who knows what. There was a smell too, stale and metallic, like old blood. My stomach churned. "Jesus, it smells like something died in here," Andy said, covering his nose. I was about to agree when I noticed something on the table. A notebook, leather-bound and worn with age. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. The writing was erratic, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. It didn't make much sense, just a lot of rambling about the creature and the dark. But one word kept appearing, over and over. It. "What do you think it means?" I asked, showing the notebook to Andy. He shook his head, frowning. "I don't know, man, but I don't like it. Maybe we should head back." For once I agreed with him. The thought of spending another minute in that cabin made my skin crawl. We turned to leave, but as we reached the door we heard it, a low rumbling sound, like the growl of some massive animal. Only it wasn't quite that. It was more guttural, more alien. We froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all around us. Andy's eyes widened in fear, and for the first time since I'd known him, he was speechless. Without a word, we bolted from the cabin, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. The sound followed us, relentless, growing more intense with each passing second. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, primal terror that I couldn't shake. We didn't stop running until we reached the stream again, gasping for breath. The sound had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. "What the hell was that?" Andy finally whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. We stood there for a moment, trying to collect ourselves, when I noticed something strange. The footprints, they were gone. The ground around us was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. "Let's just get the hell out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Andy nodded, and we started back the way we came, moving as quickly as we could. But the trail had changed. It was darker now, the trees pressing in on us from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. We'd been walking for what felt like hours when we heard it again, the rumbling. Only this time, it was different, louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it was getting closer. We broke into a run, but it was no use. The sound was everywhere, surrounding us, echoing through the trees. I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet, the air growing thick and heavy. And then we saw it. It burst from the trees in front of us, a massive hulking figure covered in matted dark fur. It stood on two legs, towering over us, its head nearly brushing the branches above. Its eyes. God, I didn't want to look at its eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. They were black, soulless, like twin voids staring into the very depths of my being. Andy screamed, a high-pitched wail that seemed to snap me out of my trance. I grabbed his arm, yanking him backward as the creature lunged at us with a speed that defied its size. We ran, ducking and weaving through the trees, but the creature was relentless. I could hear its heavy footfalls behind us, feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. It was toying with us, letting us think we had a chance before closing in again. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest was silent once more, but the terror lingered. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead where the car was parked. We scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut and locking them. For a moment, we just sat there, panting, hearts racing, waiting for the creature to appear again. But it didn't. What the hell was that thing? Andy finally whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there. I started the car, peeling out of the parking lot and speeding down the winding road, not daring to look back. We drove in silence for a long time, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed, that the creature was just waiting for the right moment to strike. But it never did. We made it back to town just as the sun was setting, and I dropped Andy off at his apartment. He didn't say much, just a quick thanks before disappearing inside. I didn't blame him. There wasn't much to say. I went home, but sleep was out of the question. I sat in the dark, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something I could explain away. The next day, I called in sick to work. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what to do next. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get that creature out of my mind. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to the mountains anytime soon, not after what I'd seen, not after what had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. That thing was still out there somewhere, waiting. I didn't want to think about it, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. One day, I'd have to go back. One day, I'd have to face it again, but not today. Today, I was just going to try to forget. My name is Talon Wexler, and this happened to me back in 2004, in the backwoods of Oregon. I was in my late 20s, a freelance photographer with a penchant for landscapes. I lived in a small town where everybody knew everybody, and the only secrets were the ones you kept from yourself. I guess you could say I was a bit of a loner, preferring the company of my camera to that of people. I had just broken up with my girlfriend, so I was eager to lose myself in work. It was a Saturday, and I was gearing up for a weekend trip to Crater Lake. A buddy of mine, Finn Walcott, was supposed to join me. Finn was an ex-Marine, tough as nails but with a wicked sense of humor. He had a way of making even the most boring situations entertaining. We joked about how the only thing we'd have to worry about was getting lost and ending up in some horror movie scenario. Little did we know how close to the truth we were. We packed up my old Jeep with camping gear, food, and Finn's trusty .45. Now, I've never been much of a gun guy, but Finn insisted. "You never know what you'll run into out there," he said with a wink. The drive was uneventful, the kind where you talk about everything and nothing. Finn teased me about my photography, calling it fancy picture taking, while I ribbed him about his conspiracy theories. It was a good time, a much-needed escape from the everyday grind. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The place was beautiful, towering pines, a clear, still lake, and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow up every sound. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We set up camp, lit a fire, and settled in for the night. Finn told me stories from his military days, some funny, some downright chilling. We laughed, drank a few beers, and by midnight we were both ready to crash. I woke up to the sound of rustling outside the tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But the noises were too deliberate, too human. I nudged Finn awake, and he groggily reached for his gun. "You hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah." "Stay quiet," he replied, his voice tense. We listened, our breath held. The rustling stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Finn motioned for me to stay put as he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The cold air rushed in, and I shivered, more from fear than the chill. "Who's there?" Finn called out, his voice steady. Silence. I grabbed my flashlight and followed him out, the beam cutting through the darkness. The campsite looked the same, but something felt off. We scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. Finn shrugged, muttering something about deer, and we headed back to the tent. The next morning we found footprints around our campsite. Large, humanoid, but definitely not human. They were too wide, the toes too elongated. Finn frowned, examining them closely. "Never seen tracks like these," he said. "Could be some kind of bear, but I'm not sure. I took pictures of the prints, more out of habit than anything else. We decided to stay another night, figuring it was probably just an animal and nothing to worry about. We spent the day hiking and taking photos, the unease of the previous night fading with the sunlight. That evening, as we sat by the fire, we heard the sound again, this time louder and closer. Finn grabbed his gun, and I picked up a hefty branch for good measure. We stood back to back, scanning the darkness. The footsteps circled us, slow and deliberate. "Show yourself," Finn shouted. Nothing. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with matted dark fur and glowing eyes. It moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace. Finn fired a shot, but it barely flinched. The creature lunged at him, and I swung my branch, hitting it squarely on the head. It howled, a guttural, blood-curdling sound that made my skin crawl. We ran, adrenaline fueling our escape. Finn fired a few more shots over his shoulder, but the creature seemed unfazed. We reached the jeep and sped off, hearts pounding, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. We told the local sheriff about our encounter, but he was skeptical, chalking it up to our imaginations and too much beer. He did send a couple of deputies to check out our campsite, but they found nothing unusual. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Finn and I returned to our normal lives, but we couldn't shake the memory of that night. We stopped talking about it, trying to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the mind. But deep down, we knew better. A few months later, Finn went missing. He had gone on another solo camping trip, something he often did to clear his head. When he didn't return, a search party was organized. They found his campsite abandoned and eerily similar to the one we had shared. His gear was there, but he was gone. No sign of a struggle, no tracks, nothing. The news hit me hard. I felt a mix of guilt and fear, wondering if the creature had found him. I went back to the sheriff, but he dismissed my concerns, saying it was probably an animal attack or that Finn had simply decided to disappear. But I knew Finn. He wouldn't just vanish without a trace. I started digging into local legends and old folklore, anything that might explain what we saw. I found stories of a creature, a kind of werewolf, that roamed the forests of Oregon. People had reported sightings over the years, but they were always brushed off as nonsense. I wasn't so sure anymore. Determined to find answers, I returned to the campsite where Finn disappeared. This time I was prepared, armed with a shotgun and enough supplies to last a week. I set up camp, the familiar sounds and smells both comforting and unsettling. I waited, each night more tense than the last. On the third night I heard it again, the footsteps circling my tent. I grabbed my gun and flashlight, stepping outside into the cold night air. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its eyes reflecting the light. I aimed and fired, the shotgun's blast echoing through the trees. The creature staggered but didn't fall. It growled, a low, menacing sound that sent chills through me. I fired again, and this time it retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep that night, sitting by the fire with my gun ready. At dawn I found more tracks leading deeper into the forest. I followed them, determined to find out what happened to Finn. The trail led me to a cave hidden behind a dense thicket. I entered cautiously, the darkness swallowing me up. Inside I found bones, animal, and humans scattered across the floor. My heart raced as I recognized Finn's dog tags among the remains. I knew then that the creature had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. I left the cave, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, sadness. They all washed over me. I knew I couldn't fight the creature alone, so I returned to town and gathered a group of friends. We armed ourselves and went back to the cave, ready to put an end to the nightmare. The battle was fierce. The creature fought with savage strength, but we had the advantage of numbers and firepower. In the end, we killed it. The beast's lifeless body, a grim reminder of the horror we had faced. We buried Finn's remains, along with those of the other victims, giving them the peace they deserved. The cave was sealed, and we made a pact never to speak of it again. The town returned to its quiet, uneventful life, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Years have passed, and I still think about Finn and the creature we encountered. I've moved on, but the experience changed me. I'm more cautious, more aware of the unknown lurking in the shadows. I still take photographs, but now I stick to safer, more populated areas. I often wonder if there are more creatures out there, hiding in the depths of the forest, waiting for their next victim. I hope not, but I can't shake the feeling that our encounter was just the tip of the iceberg. My name is Raymond Callahan, but most people just call me Rye. I've spent most of my life working as a park ranger, though that wasn't the plan originally. I was supposed to be a school teacher, settled down with my wife in a cozy little town. But life has a funny way of steering you off course, and here I am, with a rifle in my hand and the endless wilderness as my backyard. The woods have been my home for years now, a place where I can disappear from the world, and where the world mostly forgets about me. The place I work is called Eagle Creek State Park, a sprawling stretch of rugged land in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. Not exactly a tourist hotspot, but it's got its charms if you like isolation, thick forests, and the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess your sanity. We get the occasional hiker or camper, but for the most part it's just me and the trees. And that's how I like it. Except for the last couple of weeks, things have felt off. It started with a few reports of missing people, 2 college kids who never returned to their camp, a seasoned hiker whose car was found abandoned by the entrance, and most recently, a family of 4. Search parties were sent out, and the usual suspects were considered: bears, coyotes, even a rogue mountain lion. But there was no trace of them. No bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the unpredictability of nature. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was this tension in the air, like the park was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A week ago, I got a call from my boss, Dale O'Connor, who told me they were sending a couple of new rangers to help with the situation. I wasn't thrilled about it. I'm not much of a people person, and I like my space. But these weren't normal circumstances, so I agreed to show them around, make sure they didn't get lost or eaten by something. The new rangers, Greg Walters and Sam Blackwell, were younger than me by at least a decade. Greg was ex-military, tall and built like a tank, with a no-nonsense attitude that rubbed me the wrong way. Sam was quieter, more of an academic type, with a tendency to overthink everything. They seemed competent enough. but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were in over their heads. It was early morning when we set out to patrol a particularly dense part of the park where the missing family had last been seen. The sky was overcast, and the air was thick with humidity, making everything feel sticky and uncomfortable. We walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. About an hour into our hike, we came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a pile of bones, scattered and broken, half buried under a thick layer of leaves. Human bones, by the look of them. Greg and Sam stopped dead in their tracks, their faces pale. "What the hell happened here?" Greg muttered, kneeling down to get a closer look. "No idea," I replied, though my mind was racing. I'd seen animal attacks before, and this wasn't like any of them. The bones were stripped clean, but there were no teeth marks, no signs of chewing or gnawing, just bones, bleached white and dry, as if they'd been there for years, though they clearly hadn't. "We should call this in," Sam suggested, pulling out his radio. But as he reached for it, a strange sound filled the air. It was low and resonant, like a deep hum, but there was an underlying rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat. It seemed to come from all around us, vibrating through the ground, the trees, and even the air. "What the hell is that?" Greg asked, his voice tight with unease. I shook my head, unable to answer. The sound was disorienting, making it hard to think straight. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We'll radio this in when we get back to the station." We continued our patrol, but the atmosphere had changed. The woods felt oppressive, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I could tell Greg and Sam felt it too. Their easy banter had stopped, replaced by tense, whispered conversations. We didn't find anything else unusual for the next few hours, but the feeling of being watched never left us. It was almost noon when we reached a small clearing, and that's when we saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. It was big, taller than any man, with a hunched, angular frame that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was a mottled gray, rough like the bark of a tree, and its limbs were long and spindly, ending in claw-like hands. But the worst part was its face, if you could call it that. There were no features, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to absorb the light around it. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at this thing, this creature that shouldn't exist. And then it took a step forward, moving with a fluid, almost insect-like grace. Greg was the first to react. He raised his rifle, aiming it at the creature. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling slightly. The creature paused, its head, if it could be called a head, tilting slightly as if it was considering him. And then it lunged. Greg fired, the shot echoing through the trees, but it didn't slow the creature down. It moved too fast, covering the distance between us in seconds. It slammed into Greg, sending him crashing to the ground, his rifle skidding out of reach. I reacted instinctively, raising my own rifle and firing at the creature. The bullets hit it, but they didn't seem to do any damage. It didn't bleed, didn't even flinch. It was like shooting at a rock. Sam, in a panic, grabbed a branch from the ground and tried to swing it at the creature, but it was like trying to swat away a storm. The creature knocked him aside with a casual swipe of its clawed hand, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Greg was struggling beneath the creature, trying to push it off, but it was too strong. It leaned in closer, and that's when I noticed something strange. The surface of its face, the smooth, featureless part, began to shift. It rippled like water disturbed by a breeze, and then, slowly, it started to form something that looked like Greg's face. "Ray!" Greg shouted, his voice filled with terror. "Do something!" But I was frozen, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The creature's face continued to change, becoming more and more like Greg's until it was an almost perfect replica, except for the eyes. There were none. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The creature stood up, leaving Greg lying on the ground, gasping for breath. It turned towards me, and I could see my own reflection in its newly formed face. My own face staring back at me, devoid of any emotion, any life. I don't know what happened next. My memory is a blur, a jumbled mess of images and sounds. I remember firing my rifle again and again, emptying the clip into the creature as it advanced towards me. I remember Greg screaming, Sam shouting something unintelligible. And then, nothing. When I came to, the creature was gone. Greg was lying on the ground, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes wide open in shock. Sam was kneeling beside him, trying to stop the bleeding from a deep gash across his chest. But it was too late. Greg was gone. The creature had vanished, but it had left something behind. Lying on the ground where it had been standing was a pile of bones, fresh, clean, and white, just like the ones we'd found earlier. We radioed for help, and within an hour, a team arrived to take us back to the station. They found Greg's body and the bones, but no sign of the creature. Sam and I were questioned, but there was nothing we could say that made any sense. How could we explain what we'd seen, what we'd experienced? In the end, they ruled it as an animal attack, some kind of large predator, though they couldn't say what. The bones were taken for analysis, but I never heard anything more about them. Sam left the Park Service after that. He moved away, somewhere far from the woods, and I haven't heard from him since. As for me, I'm still here at Eagle Creek, doing my job. There are still hikers, campers, and the occasional search party for the lost. But the woods have changed for me. They're not just trees and trails anymore. There's something else, something alive, something that watches and waits. But I keep going, because what else is there to do? My name is Arlo Tierney, and I'm here to tell you about the worst night of my life. This happened back in 1993 when I was just getting started as a freelance photographer. I lived in a small apartment in Tullytown, Pennsylvania, not far from where I grew up. Life was good mostly. My girlfriend Melina and I were pretty serious. We spent most of our weekends driving around the countryside, looking for interesting places to shoot and relax. This story isn't about Melina, though. It's about a night that still haunts me to this day. It was late October, and the air was getting crisp. I'd just finished a shoot in Bristol, not far from my place, and decided to take a detour on my way home. I'd heard about an abandoned factory out in the sticks, a perfect spot for some gritty, atmospheric shots. I had an old Canon AE, one that I loved using for these kinds of scenes. Anyway, I didn't tell Melina where I was going. She'd have just worried, and I didn't think it was a big deal. Boy, was I wrong. The place was a real dump, covered in graffiti and falling apart. But it had character, you know. As I was setting up my gear, I heard some rustling. Figured it was just raccoons or something. This place was pretty isolated. I snapped a few shots, checking the light and angles, when I noticed a faint glow coming from one of the factory buildings. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. Definitely a light, flickering like a candle or a flashlight. Being the curious idiot that I am, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my camera and headed toward the building. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking like a bad horror movie sound effect. Inside, it was dark and musty, with the smell of rust and decay heavy in the air. Debris was scattered everywhere. The light was coming from a room at the far end. As I got closer, I heard voices, low, murmuring voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they didn't sound friendly. I peeked through a crack in the door. There were 3 guys standing around a makeshift altar, muttering some kind of chant. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but they were dressed in ragged clothes and looked like they hadn't bathed in weeks. This wasn't some harmless hobo gathering. It felt sinister. Before I could process what was happening, one of them turned and saw me. He yelled something, and the other 2 spun around. I bolted. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could toward the exit. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps pounding on the cracked concrete floor. I made it out of the building and into the open, but I could still hear them behind me. I ducked into a thicket of trees and kept running, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours, tripping over roots and scraping my hands on branches. Eventually, I found a dirt road and followed it until I came across an old farmhouse. The place looked deserted, but I was desperate. I pounded on the door, shouting for help. After what seemed like forever, the door creaked open, and an old man peered out. His name was Vernon, and he looked like he'd seen better days. But he let me in. I told Vernon what had happened, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he shook his head and muttered something about them cult folks causing trouble around these parts. He offered to drive me back to town, and I gratefully accepted. We got into his beat-up pickup and drove in silence. The roads were dark and winding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We reached Tullytown without incident, and Vernon dropped me off at my apartment. I thanked him and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I called Melina and told her everything. She insisted on coming over, and I was glad for the company. She stayed with me that night, and we didn't sleep much. I kept hearing those footsteps, those voices, echoing in my head. The next day I went to the police. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The factory was out of their jurisdiction, and without more evidence they couldn't launch an investigation. I felt helpless. Over the next few days I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I buried myself in work, but the memory of that night lingered. A week later I got a call from Vernon. He sounded shaken, said he'd seen something in the woods near his farmhouse, something that didn't belong there. He asked if I could come and take a look. I hesitated, but I couldn't ignore his plea. Melina wanted to come with me, but I told her to stay put. I didn't want to risk her safety. When I arrived at Vernon's place, he led me into the woods. We walked in silence, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. After about half an hour, we reached a clearing. In the center was a large flat stone stained with what looked like dried blood. Vernon said he'd found it the day after I'd been there, along with strange symbols carved into the trees around the clearing. As we stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no coincidence. The cult, or whatever they were, had been here. They'd performed some kind of ritual, and now they knew I was on to them. I took some photos of the clearing and the symbols, but I knew it wasn't enough. We needed more evidence, something concrete to take to the authorities. We decided to stake out the area that night. Vernon had an old hunting rifle, and I had my camera. We hid in the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. The hours dragged on, and I could feel the tension building. Around midnight, we heard footsteps. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, carrying torches. It was the same 3 guys I'd seen in the factory. They approached the stone, and one of them began chanting. The other 2 stood guard, their eyes scanning the trees. Vernon and I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. The ritual went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. We waited another hour before daring to move. I took more photos and gathered what evidence I could. The next day, we went back to the police. This time, they couldn't ignore us. With the photos and Vernon's testimony, they launched an investigation. It took a few days, but they eventually raided the factory. The cult members were arrested, and the place was shut down. It turned out they were part of a larger network, performing rituals and sacrifices in secluded locations across the state. In the end, they were charged with multiple counts of murder and kidnapping. The trial was long and harrowing, but they were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I could go back to my normal life. But the truth is, that night changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the darkness that lurks in the world. Melina and I eventually got married, and we moved to a different town. We have 2 kids now, and I've made a decent living as a photographer. But every now and then, I think back to that night in the factory, and I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't taken that detour. It's a reminder that sometimes curiosity can lead you down a dark and dangerous path. Years later, I heard about a similar incident in a neighboring state, another abandoned building, another group of people performing rituals. It made me wonder if the cult was truly gone or if they'd just moved on to another place. I guess I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain, I'll never forget the fear I felt that night, and I'll always be grateful for Vernon's help. Without him, I might not be here to tell this story. In the end, we all have our own battles to fight, our own demons to face. Mine just happened to be more literal than most, but I've learned to live with it, to carry on despite the fear, because in the end life goes on, and we have to find a way to move forward, even if the shadows of the past still linger. I never thought much of this town until the day I found myself on the receiving end of something I can't fully explain. My name's Caleb Westcott, and I've been the sheriff of Calhoun Springs, Tennessee since 1986. Not much happens around here, mostly petty thefts, some disputes over property lines, and a few bar brawls that get out of hand on Saturday nights. You could say it's a quiet place, nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachians, where the trees grow tall and the fog clings to the valleys like a stubborn blanket. My day started like any other. I woke up early, had my usual cup of coffee, and drove to the station, ready to face whatever minor disturbances might come my way. My deputy, Rick Henderson, was already there, feet up on his desk, flipping through some old crime reports. "Morning, Caleb," Rick said without looking up. "Morning, Rick," I replied, hanging my hat on the hook by the door. "Anything interesting?" "Just the usual. Got a call from old Mrs. Darnell about a prowler again. Probably just her imagination running wild." Mrs. Darnell was known for her overactive imagination. She'd call us every other week about shadows in the woods behind her house, convinced that someone or something was watching her. We'd check it out, find nothing, and she'd calm down until the next time. I made a mental note to swing by later and put her mind at ease. The rest of the morning passed without incident, just paperwork and small talk with the folks who wandered in. But around noon, things took a turn. The call came in from the Mallister farm, a good 15 miles out of town. Ethan Mallister sounded shaken, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Sheriff, you need to get out here, now. There's something wrong." His voice trailed off, and I could hear the panic in his breathing. "What is it, Ethan? Calm down and tell me what's going on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's my cattle. They're all dead, torn to shreds. I don't know what could have done this." Cattle killings weren't unheard of, but they were rare. Usually it was a wild dog or a bear that had wandered too close. But the way Ethan was talking, it didn't sound like anything that could be explained away so easily. "Stay put, Ethan. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, grabbing my hat and motioning for Rick to follow. We jumped into the cruiser, and I floored it down the winding road toward the Mallister place. The drive took us through dense forests, the kind that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. I tried to keep my mind focused on the task at hand, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my head, something telling me that today wasn't going to be like any other. When we arrived at the farm, Ethan was waiting for us at the gate, his face pale and his hands trembling. He was a big man, built like an ox, but today he looked small, almost fragile. "Show me," I said, and he led us to the pasture. The sight that greeted us was something out of a nightmare. The ground was soaked in blood, the grass trampled and stained with gore. The cattle, or what was left of them, were scattered across the field, their bodies torn open, organs spilling out like someone had ripped them apart with their bare hands. Rick swore under his breath, and I could feel the bile rising in my throat. I had seen some gruesome things in my time, but this was something else entirely. "What in God's name could have done this?" Rick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. The wounds were too large, too savage, for any animal I knew of. It wasn't just the killing. It was the way it was done, like something had taken pleasure in tearing these creatures apart. Ethan was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "I heard them, Sheriff. I heard them screaming. It was like they were being tortured." "Did you see anything? Anyone?" I asked, trying to make sense of the chaos. He shook his head. "No, but I heard it. This sound, like nothing I've ever heard before. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human." I looked at Rick, who seemed just as lost as I was. This wasn't something we were prepared for. I could see the unease in his eyes, the same feeling gnawing at me. "We need to figure out what did this," I said, trying to sound confident. "Rick, take some pictures and let's get a better look at these wounds. Maybe we can figure out what kind of weapon or tool was used." Rick nodded and pulled out his camera, but as he started to take pictures, we heard a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from all around us. It was deep, almost guttural, and it sent a chill down my spine. "What the hell was that?" Rick asked, his voice shaking. Ethan's face went even paler, and he started to back away. "That's it. That's the sound I heard before." I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The air felt thick, oppressive, and there was a smell like something rotting. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, panic creeping into his voice. "Whatever did this is still out there." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. I had no idea what we were dealing with, and the last thing I wanted was for us to end up like those cattle. I motioned for Rick to start moving back toward the car, but as we did, the noise grew louder, more insistent, like it was getting closer. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, just a blur, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Rick. Yeah, I did," he replied, his voice barely audible. We started moving faster, trying to keep our eyes on the surrounding trees. But the noise kept growing louder, more menacing. It was like we were being hunted. We reached the car and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The sound was deafening now, like it was right on top of us. "Get in!" I yelled, and we scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse and sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up gravel as we raced away from the farm. The noise didn't follow us. As soon as we were back on the main road, it stopped, leaving only the sound of our heavy breathing and the hum of the engine. "What the hell was that?" Rick asked, his voice filled with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, my mind racing to make sense of what we had just experienced. "But whatever it is, it's not something we can handle on our own." We drove back to town in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we got to the station, I called the state troopers and told them about the situation. They promised to send someone out, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of the noise, the blur of movement, the sheer brutality of what had been done to those cattle. That night I stayed late at the station, going over the pictures Rick had taken. The wounds were deep, jagged, like something had torn through flesh and bone with ease. But there were no signs of any weapon, no clues to what could have caused such carnage. As I stared at the photos, I felt that same chill from the farm, the sense that something was watching, waiting. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This was just my mind playing tricks on me, trying to fill in the gaps with fears and shadows. But deep down I knew that this wasn't over. Something had come to Calhoun Springs, something that didn't belong, and it wasn't finished yet. The next day, I got a call from the state troopers. They had sent a couple of guys out to the Mallister farm, but they hadn't found anything. The bodies were still there, but whatever had done it was gone, leaving no trace behind. I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something that could be tracked or hunted down. It was something else, something that defied logic and reason. As the days passed, the town started to settle back into its routine, the horror of that day slowly fading from memory. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there somewhere, in the woods, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And so I kept my guard up, my eyes always scanning the tree line, my hand never far from my gun. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew that when it came, I'd be ready, because whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to catch me off guard. My name is Leland Fairbanks, and this happened to me in 2003. I was living in Ula, Missouri, a small town where everyone knew everyone else. I had just turned 30 and had been working as a mechanic at the local auto shop. My life was simple work, beer at the local bar, and fishing on weekends. I guess you could say I was content. I didn't expect things to change, but that summer, everything did. One night, after a long day of fixing engines, I headed over to Pete's Tavern. It was a dive bar, the kind of place where you could find old-timers nursing a drink and telling stories about the good old days. I walked in, nodding at a few familiar faces, and took my usual spot at the bar. Pete, the owner, slid me a cold one without a word. We had this unspoken understanding. I drank, he poured. "Hey Leland, you hear about those folks going missing?" asked Sam, an old buddy of mine, sitting a few stools down. "Yeah, I heard," I replied, taking a swig of my beer. "Probably just folks getting lost in the woods." "Nah, man," Sam insisted, leaning in closer. "There's something weird about it. My cousin works with the sheriff's office. Says they found something strange at one of the sites." "Strange how?" "Like claw marks, big ones, and fur. Not from any animal we know around here." I chuckled. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Sam." He shook his head. "I'm serious, Leland. You should be careful if you're heading out to those woods." I waved him off. "I'll be fine." A week later, I decided to take my truck and head out to the forest for some camping and fishing. It was a good way to clear my head, and besides, I didn't buy into all that superstitious nonsense. I packed my gear, threw it in the back of my old Chevy, and drove out to my favorite spot by the lake. The first night was peaceful. I pitched my tent, built a fire, and enjoyed the solitude. The air was still and crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were my only companions. I was in my element, far from the noise and worries of everyday life. But on the second night, things took a turn. I was sitting by the fire, cooking up some fish I'd caught earlier, when I heard a noise. It was a rustling in the bushes not far from my camp. At first I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. "Who's there?" I called out, standing up and grabbing my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, and returned to my dinner. As the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep down I knew something was off. Just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again, a low, guttural noise that made my blood run cold. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the perimeter of my camp, the beam of light bouncing off trees and shadows. Then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the light, watching me from the edge of the woods. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal. My breath caught in my throat as the creature stepped into the light. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with a muscular humanoid body covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and wolf, with sharp, elongated features and fangs that glinted in the firelight. I froze, not sure if I was seeing things. The creature snarled, a sound that reverberated through the night, and took a step towards me. My instincts kicked in. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground. I stumbled over roots and rocks, adrenaline driving me forward. My truck was parked about a mile away, but in the dark, it felt like an eternity. I could feel the creature closing in, its breath hot on my neck. Just as I thought I was done for, I burst into a clearing and saw my truck. Fumbling with the keys, I threw myself into the cab and slammed the door shut. The creature hit the side of the truck with a force that rocked the vehicle. I jammed the key into the ignition and prayed it would start. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tearing out of there as fast as the old Chevy could go. I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of town. I pulled over, shaking, and tried to catch my breath. What the hell had I just seen? My mind raced with questions and doubts. Part of me wanted to go to the sheriff, but what would I say? That I'd been chased by a werewolf. They'd lock me up for sure. The next day, I went back to the site with a couple of friends, Joey and Cliff, armed to the teeth. Joey had a shotgun, and Cliff carried a hunting rifle. We approached the camp cautiously, the morning sun doing little to dispel the fear that clung to me. The campsite was trashed. My tent was shredded, gear scattered, deep claw marks raked the trees, and there were tufts of dark fur caught in the branches. Joey whistled low. "Damn, Leland, what the hell happened here?" I told them everything. To my surprise, they believed me. Joey had grown up hearing stories about strange creatures in the woods, and Cliff, a skeptic by nature, couldn't deny the evidence in front of us. We decided to set a trap, baiting the area with fresh meat and setting up cameras. It felt like something out of a monster hunting show, but we were desperate for answers. For 3 nights, we camped out in shifts, waiting for the creature to return. On the 4th night, it did. I was on watch, the fire crackling low, when I heard the familiar rustling. I woke Joey and Cliff, and we prepared ourselves. The creature emerged from the shadows, just as terrifying as before. It approached the bait cautiously, sniffing the air. "Now," Joey shouted, and we sprang into action. The gunshots echoed through the forest, but the creature was fast, too fast. It dodged and weaved, letting out a furious howl. Cliff managed to get a shot off, hitting it in the shoulder. The creature roared in pain but didn't go down. It charged at us, knocking Joey to the ground. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung with all my might, hitting the creature across the face. It staggered back, giving Joey time to scramble away. Cliff fired again, this time hitting it in the chest. The creature let out one last anguished cry before collapsing to the ground. We stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body. Up close, it was even more horrifying, an unnatural blend of human and wolf, its eyes still glowing faintly in the moonlight. Joey nudged it with his boot, making sure it was really dead. "What the hell do we do now?" Cliff asked, his voice shaky. "We need to get the sheriff," I said. "He has to see this." Reluctantly, we loaded the creature into the back of Joey's truck, covering it with a tarp. The drive back to town was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we reached the sheriff's office, we pulled him aside and showed him the evidence. Sheriff Davies was a grizzled, no-nonsense man who'd seen his fair share of strange things. But even he was taken aback. He inspected the creature, his face grim. "This is beyond anything I've ever dealt with," he admitted. The next few days were a blur of questions and investigations. The creature was taken away by some government types who didn't offer any explanations. The official story was that it was a bear attack, but we knew better. Life in Ula slowly returned to normal. But for those of us who'd faced the creature, things would never be the same. We had stared into the face of something monstrous, something that defied explanation. We survived, but the memory lingered, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown. As for me, I still go fishing, but I never venture into those woods alone. And every time I hear a rustling in the bushes, my heart skips a beat. And I remember the night I came face to face with the impossible. It was a Thursday afternoon in 2001 when I decided to head up to my family's old cabin in the woods of West Virginia. I've always been a city guy, working as a software engineer for a startup in D.C., but my roots were rural, deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The cabin had been in my family for generations, but I hadn't visited in years. Too many work trips, too many deadlines. That was life. But after a rough breakup with my fiancée and a week of staring at my computer screen without making any progress, I knew I needed a break. I hadn't really planned the trip. I just packed a few things, jumped into my old Jeep Cherokee, and started driving. By the time I got to the cabin, it was late in the day, and the sun was already dipping behind the ridges. The place was in worse shape than I remembered. Weeds had grown up all around it, and the roof sagged just a bit more than it had the last time I saw it. Inside, it smelled like musty wood and old books, but I liked that. It smelled like home. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning, dusting off old furniture, and airing out the place. It wasn't long before I realized I'd forgotten to pick up some essentials, things like bottled water, canned food, and maybe some firewood, since it was still chilly at night in the mountains this time of year. I'd thought I'd have time to do a proper run into town the next morning. The nearest town was a good hour's drive away, and I didn't want to make that trip tonight, so I figured I'd make do with what I had. There was still an old water pump behind the cabin, and after some effort I got it working. The water tasted metallic, but it was fine. As for food, there were some hunting supplies and a few fishing rods in the shed, which my dad and I used to take out to the nearby creek. Fishing might do me some good anyway, clear my head a little. The night fell quicker than I expected, and soon the cabin was shrouded in the kind of quiet that only comes in the wilderness. No traffic, no hum of distant machinery, just the soft rustle of the trees and the occasional owl. I was sitting by the fire, sipping on some cheap whiskey I found in the cabinet, trying to work up the courage to dig into an old paperback I'd brought along. That's when I heard the first sound. At first it was just a faint thump, like something hitting the ground outside. I thought maybe a deer had wandered too close and spooked itself. I ignored it and went back to my book. But then it happened again, louder this time, more like a heavy stomp. A few seconds later I heard the sound of branches snapping. This wasn't just an animal walking around in the brush. It was bigger, heavier. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from the counter. I was hesitant to check, but curiosity and a little bit of pride pushed me to the door. I opened it slowly and shone the light into the darkness. There was nothing at first, just trees and the faint outline of the water pump near the shed. But then I saw something move fast, darting between the trees. It wasn't a person. It moved on all fours, low to the ground. And it was big, much bigger than a coyote. Damn it, I muttered under my breath. Could have been a bear, I thought. We'd had a few around the area when I was a kid, but this thing didn't move like a bear. It was more deliberate, calculated, almost as if it knew I was watching. I turned off the flashlight and backed inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't exactly armed, save for the old hunting rifle my granddad left me in the corner of the cabin, which hadn't been fired in years. I checked the bullets and loaded it up, just in case. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every creak of the wood floors seemed too loud. For a while, I just stood there, rifle in hand, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The night was still again, except for the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. I told myself I was overreacting and decided to sleep with the rifle next to my bed, just to be safe. That's when the scratching started. At first it was faint, like nails dragging against the side of the cabin. I thought it was the wind until it grew louder. The sound came from the wall behind me, behind the old kitchen stove that sat cold and unused. I froze, listening. The scratches became faster, more frantic, like something desperate to get in. I grabbed the rifle and pointed it at the wall, though I didn't know what good it would do if something was actually coming through. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I stepped closer to the wall slowly, listening for any sign of movement. My hand reached out, almost unconsciously, to touch the surface. And when my fingers brushed the rough wood, the whole wall shook. I staggered back, gripping the rifle tighter, as the wall rattled again, something slamming into it from the outside. The cabin wasn't that big, and if whatever was out there wanted in, I didn't think the old boards would hold for long. A guttural noise echoed through the night, a noise that sent a chill through my bones. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was deeper, like the rumble of a heavy engine, but organic, alive. My hands trembled as I lifted the rifle to my shoulder, stepping back toward the bedroom. I didn't know what else to do. There was no phone signal out here, and the Jeep was parked too far from the cabin for me to make a run for it. I wasn't even sure I could find my keys in the dark if I tried. Then the cabin's front door, the one I had locked only an hour earlier, began to creak. The door frame groaned as the pressure mounted, and I knew someone, was trying to force its way inside. Without thinking, I aimed the rifle at the door and fired. The blast was deafening, the kickback nearly throwing me off balance. But I held my ground. For a moment, the door stopped moving. Silence. But then a shadow, bigger than any man I'd ever seen, slipped through the now cracked door frame. It was hunched, covered in thick, matted fur, its limbs too long, too distorted. The thing's face, it wasn't human, and it wasn't entirely animal either. It had a snout, but not like a wolf's. It was broader, more like a bear's, and it stank like rot and decay. It lunged at me faster than I could react. I fired again, but the bullet grazed its shoulder. The creature barely flinched. Its massive hand, or claw, slammed into me, knocking me backward, the rifle flying out of my grip. I hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of me. The thing stood over me, its breath hot and rancid. I scrambled for anything, my hands finding an old fireplace poker by the hearth. I swung it wildly, connecting with the creature's side, but it only snarled in response. In a panic, I jammed the poker into its side with all my strength, and this time it let out a sharp, wheezing noise, almost like pain. It backed off, staggering. I grabbed the rifle and fired a final shot, hitting it square in the chest. The thing collapsed, its limbs twitching for a few seconds before it finally went still. I stood there shaking, staring at the body lying on the floor. It was massive, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen up close, and its face, God, its face. I'd never seen anything like it before. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. It was dead. I didn't sleep that night. I waited for the morning, watching the thing's body, making sure it wasn't getting up. When the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, I grabbed my keys, threw whatever I could into the Jeep, and left that place behind. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I left with the memory of what lay on that cabin floor, the proof that something was out there in those woods, something ancient and monstrous, something that defied explanation. I never went back to the cabin, and I never told anyone the full story. But the experience changed me forever. It taught me that the world is full of mysteries, and some of them are best left undisturbed. My name is Austin Pelkey, and this happened to me in 2016. I was a regular guy, just out of college, working a dead-end job at a hardware store in Arkville, a small town tucked away in the Catskill Mountains. I'd grown up in the city, so the whole small-town vibe was new to me. I moved here because my Uncle George owned a cabin and offered me a cheap place to stay. I figured, why not? I could save some money, breathe fresh air, maybe figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Plus the place had Wi-Fi, which was pretty much all I needed. George was one of those old-school types, gruff, no nonsense, and perpetually busy. He spent most of his time out in the woods, hunting or fishing. He tried teaching me a few things, but honestly, I was more interested in my Xbox and Netflix. Still, I liked the guy. He was the closest thing I had to a dad since my old man took off when I was a kid. It was a Friday night, and I'd just finished a long shift at the hardware store. My coworker Melanie invited me to a bonfire party out by the lake. Melanie was cool, a bit of a tomboy, and the only person I'd befriended in town. I figured a few beers and some laughs wouldn't hurt. When I got home, George was packing up for one of his weekend hunting trips. "Hey, Austin," he said without looking up from his gear. "I'm heading out for a few days. You going to be all right?" "Yeah, sure," I replied, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Going to a party tonight with Melanie. Should be fun. Just be careful out there," he said, finally making eye contact. "The woods can be dangerous at night." I shrugged it off, as any 20-something would. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Bears? Wolves? I doubted it. The most dangerous thing I expected to encounter was a skunk, or maybe a drunk local. The bonfire was in full swing by the time I got there. People I recognized from the store and a few other places were milling about, drinking, laughing, and generally having a good time. Melanie spotted me and waved me over. "About time you showed up," she teased, handing me a beer. "Thought you got lost." "Nah, just had to make sure my uncle wasn't going to miss me too much," I joked, cracking the can open. "What did I miss?" "Not much, just the usual town gossip," she said, rolling her eyes. "You know how it is." We chatted for a while, shared a few laughs, and the night wore on. The fire crackled, casting long shadows into the dark woods beyond. I remember feeling relaxed, even happy for the first time in a long while. It was a nice change of pace from my usual routine. Around midnight, Melanie suggested we take a walk down by the lake. I agreed, needing to stretch my legs and get away from the crowd for a bit. We strolled along the shore, talking about everything and nothing. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only get out in the country. Then we heard it, a low, guttural noise coming from the woods. Melanie and I stopped in our tracks, exchanging puzzled glances. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound confident. "A coyote or something." "That didn't sound like any coyote I've ever heard," she replied, her voice tinged with fear. I was about to suggest we head back to the bonfire when we heard it again, closer this time. My heart started to pound. There was something unsettling about the sound, something that set my nerves on edge. "Maybe we should go back," Melanie said, her eyes wide. "Yeah, good idea," I agreed, turning to head back up the path. That's when we saw it. A hulking figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, and covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes glinted in the firelight, and its teeth. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. They were sharp, menacing. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Melanie's hand and pulling her along. We sprinted back toward the bonfire, my mind racing. What the hell was that thing? A bear? No, it didn't look like any bear I'd ever seen. We burst into the clearing, gasping for breath. I tried to explain what we'd seen, but my words came out jumbled and frantic. The others laughed it off, blaming it on the beer or a trick of the light. "Relax, man," said Randy, one of the locals. "You've probably just seen a deer or something." But Melanie and I knew what we saw. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything that should be out there. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed close to the fire, my eyes darting toward the woods, half expecting the creature to come charging out at any moment. But it didn't. Eventually, people started to leave, and the party died down. Melanie offered me a ride home, and I gladly accepted. There was no way I was walking back through those woods alone. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept replaying the encounter, trying to make sense of it. By morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and pretend it hadn't happened. So I called George. "Hey, Uncle George," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You got a minute?" "Sure, kid. What's up?" I told him everything, from the bonfire to the walk by the lake and the creature we'd seen. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Did you hear me?" I asked, starting to feel impatient. "I heard you," he finally replied. "Austin, listen to me carefully. Stay inside. Keep the doors and windows locked. I'll be back as soon as I can." "What? Why?" I demanded. "What is it?" "It's a long story," he said, his tone serious. "Just do as I say." "All right," I agreed, more out of confusion than anything else. What did George know that I didn't? I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself with video games and TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods and that creature. George returned the next day, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. He had his hunting rifle with him, which was unusual. George never brought his guns into the house. "All right, kid," he said, sitting me down at the kitchen table. "It's time you knew the truth." He proceeded to tell me about the legends of the area, stories passed down through generations. According to him, there was something out there, a creature that was neither man nor beast. Some called it a werewolf, but George didn't like that term. He said it was too Hollywood, too sensational. But whatever it was real, and it was dangerous. "I've seen it before," he admitted, his voice low. "Years ago, when I was about your age, my friends and I went camping out by the lake, just like you. We heard the same noises, saw the same figure. 2 of my friends didn't make it back." I stared at him, my mind reeling. This was insane. It couldn't be true. But the look in George's eyes told me he believed every word. "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling a knot of fear in my stomach. "We stay vigilant," he said. "And if it comes near, we defend ourselves." The next few days were tense. George and I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the rifle within arm's reach. Melanie came over a couple of times, and we filled her in on what George had told me. She took it surprisingly well, considering. "I knew there was something off about this place," she said. "My grandpa used to tell stories about strange things in the woods, but I always thought he was just trying to scare me. One night, we heard it again, the same low, guttural noise echoing through the trees. George grabbed the rifle, and we went out onto the porch, straining to see into the darkness. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard. "There," Melanie whispered, pointing toward the tree line. The creature was back, its eyes glowing in the moonlight. It stood there watching us, its breath visible in the cool night air. George raised the rifle, aiming carefully. "Get inside," he ordered, not taking his eyes off the creature. Melanie and I retreated into the cabin, peeking out from behind the door. George fired a shot, the sound echoing through the night. The creature let out a howl and disappeared into the woods. For a moment, we all stood there, breathless, waiting. But it didn't come back. The next day, George decided we needed to do something more. He couldn't stay and protect us forever. We had to find a way to deal with the creature once and for all. He contacted a friend of his, a man named Marcus, who supposedly knew about these things. Marcus arrived the following evening, a rugged-looking guy with a no-nonsense attitude. "We need to track it," Marcus said after George filled him in. "Find its lair and take it out." It sounded crazy, But what choice did we have? We couldn't live in fear forever. So, armed with rifles and flashlights, we ventured into the woods, following the tracks Marcus claimed belonged to the creature. We walked for hours, deeper into the forest than I'd ever been. The trees closed in around us, and the air grew colder. I kept close to George, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and windows shattered. Marcus held up a hand, signaling us to stop. "This is it," he whispered. "Stay alert." We approached the cabin cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The place reeked of decay, and the ground was littered with bones. My stomach turned at the sight. Suddenly, the creature appeared, charging at us from the shadows. It was fast, too fast. Marcus fired his rifle, but the creature dodged and knocked him to the ground. George and I opened fire, the bullets tearing into its flesh. The creature let out a deafening roar and slashed at George, sending him sprawling. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed the nearest weapon, a rusty machete lying among the bones, and swung at the creature. It yelped in pain, stumbling back. I kept swinging, driven by fear and adrenaline, until the creature collapsed, lifeless at my feet. We stood there, panting, staring at the creature's body. It was over. We had killed it. George was hurt, but alive. Marcus helped him up, and we made our way back to our cabin. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the forest. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. We didn't talk much on the way back. There wasn't much to say. We had faced something unimaginable and survived. But the scars, both physical and mental, would stay with us. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. George's wounds healed, and the nightmares began to fade. Melanie and I grew closer, bonded by the shared experience. We never spoke of the creature again, not in detail. It was a chapter of our lives we were eager to close. George went back to his hunting trips, but he never ventured too far. I eventually moved back to the city, finding a job and trying to put the past behind me. Melanie visited often, and we stayed close, a constant reminder of the ordeal we had survived. Years later, I still think about that night sometimes, especially when the moon is full and the air grows cold. I wonder if there are more creatures out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. But then, I shake it off, focusing on the present, grateful for the life I have and the people in it. The past is a dark place, full of shadows and mysteries. But it's also a part of who I am, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, we can find the strength to survive, and that, in the end, is what matters most. I never thought I'd find myself crawling through the dense underbrush of the Great Smoky Mountains, but here I was, in the year 1996, doing just that. My name is Vince Falcone, and I've always been a bit of a wanderer, never sticking too long in one place. This trip was supposed to be a reset button, a chance to clear my head and maybe catch a fish or two. I'd packed light, a couple of changes of clothes, my fishing gear, and a cooler with enough beer to keep me company. Driving out there, my GPS decided to throw a fit, losing signal just as I hit a fork in the road. There were no signs, just two dirt paths diverging into the green. I took the left one, thinking it looked more traveled. Big mistake. After about 20 minutes, it became clear I'd taken a wrong turn. The road got narrower and more rugged, the kind of place where you'd expect to find an old man with a banjo telling you you've got a pretty mouth. Just as I was about to turn around, I saw it, a rusty mailbox half buried in weeds, the name Heller, barely legible. Curiosity got the better of me. I figured I could ask for directions, maybe even get a cold drink. The driveway was long and winding, lined with towering pine trees that seemed to close in around me as I drove further in. At the end of it, there was a house that looked like it hadn't seen a lick of paint since the Reagan administration. I knocked on the door and waited, hearing nothing but the distant rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. After a moment, a woman opened it. She was middle-aged, with stringy blonde hair and a nervous smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes darting behind me as if expecting someone else. "Yeah, sorry to bother you. I think I took a wrong turn. I'm trying to get to this cabin I rented," I said, showing her the address on my phone. She barely glanced at it before nodding. "You're way off. Best turn around and take the other road back there. That should get you on the right track." I thanked her and turned to leave, but then I noticed something odd. Through the crack in the door, I saw a man. He was staring at me, eyes hollow and fixed. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and there was something off about him. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "You sure you're okay?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice light. "Just fine," she replied a bit too quickly, her smile fading. As I drove back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. I found the right path and made it to the cabin just as the sun was beginning to set. The place was small but cozy, right on the edge of a pristine lake. The perfect spot to unwind, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I had a couple of beers, grilled a steak, and enjoyed the silence. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I took my fishing rod and hiked around the lake, casting a few lines and catching nothing but the occasional clump of weeds. By noon, I was back at the cabin, feeling pleasantly tired. That's when I noticed the figure standing at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw him move. It was the same man I'd seen at the Heller house. He was just standing there, watching me. I waved, but he didn't respond. Unease settled in my gut like a bad meal. Ignoring him as best as I could, I went inside and locked the door. Hours passed, and I tried to distract myself with an old book I'd brought along. But every time I glanced out the window, he was there, unmoving. It was like he was waiting for something. By nightfall, he was gone. I convinced myself it was nothing, just a local eccentric out for a walk. But when I stepped outside to check, I found something that sent a shiver down my spine. Footprints leading from the edge of the forest to my cabin door and back again. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the old cabin sounded like footsteps, every rustle of leaves like whispers. When dawn finally broke, I decided I'd had enough of my wilderness retreat. I packed my things and headed out, determined to get back to civilization. Driving down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that gaunt face staring back at me. But the road remained empty. I sighed in relief as I reached the main highway. feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. Then I saw her, the woman from the Heller house, standing on the side of the road, waving frantically. I pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. "Yes, please," she said breathlessly. "I need to get away from here." I didn't ask questions. She climbed into the passenger seat, and we sped off. It wasn't until we were a good few miles away that she started talking. "My name's Mara. That man you saw, he's my brother Dean. There's something wrong with him. He's not right." I glanced over at her, noting the fear in her eyes. "What do you mean, not right?" "He was always strange, but after our parents died, he got worse. He started hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. And then, people started disappearing. Hikers, campers, anyone who got too close." My heart pounded as I listened. "Why didn't you leave before?" "I couldn't," she whispered. "He wouldn't let me. But when you came, I saw a chance." We drove in silence for a while, the weight of her words sinking in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but the evidence was there. The footprints, the watching, the way he made my skin crawl. We reached a small town and I pulled into a gas station. Mara looked at me, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Stay here," I told her. "I'm going to get us some help." I walked into the station and called the local sheriff, explaining everything as best as I could. They promised to send someone right away. When I got back to the car, Mara was gone. The passenger door was open and there was no sign of her. Panic surged through me as I looked around, calling her name. That's when I saw him. Dean, standing at the edge of the parking lot, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile, and raised a finger to his lips. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I jumped into the car and drove like a madman until I reached the sheriff's office. I burst in, breathless and wild-eyed, demanding to speak to someone in charge. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Days passed, and there was no sign of Mara or Dean. The authorities conducted a search, but it turned up nothing. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd failed her, that I'd left her to a fate worse than death. Then, about a week later, I got a call. It was the sheriff, his voice grim. "We found something," he said. "You'd better come down here." When I arrived, they led me to a secluded area near the forest. There, in a shallow grave, were the remains of several people. Among them was Mara. The sight of her lifeless body, broken and discarded, made my blood run cold. Dean was nowhere to be found. The sheriff told me they'd keep looking, but I knew it was hopeless. He was out there somewhere, watching, waiting. I left New Hampshire soon after, unable to stay in a place that held so many nightmares. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the memory of those hollow eyes, the feeling of being hunted. I don't know what Dean was or what drove him to such madness, but I do know one thing. Somewhere out there, he's still out there, and I'll never forget the terror he brought into my life. My name is Callum Hargrove, and this happened to me back in 1998. At the time, I was just a regular guy working a dead-end job at a hardware store in Fenville, Michigan. It was a small town with not much going on, but it suited me fine. I wasn't ambitious. I just wanted to get by and maybe have a few beers with my buddies on the weekends. Life was simple, uneventful, and predictable. One Friday night, my friends and I were hanging out at Joe's Tavern, the local watering hole. We were just a bunch of guys from high school who never really left town. There was Ernie, the loudmouth who always had a story to tell. Paulie, the quiet one who was good with his hands and fixed everything in town. And then there was me, the guy who mostly listened and laughed at their jokes. This particular night, Ernie had a wild idea. He wanted to check out an old abandoned factory just outside of town. Rumor had it the place was haunted, or something. I wasn't much for ghost stories, but I figured what the hell, it beat sitting around doing nothing. So we finished our beers and piled into Ernie's beat-up truck, heading out towards the factory. The factory was an old brick building, covered in graffiti and overgrown with weeds. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. We hopped out of the truck, and Ernie led the way, flashlight in hand, like he knew what he was doing. "Guys, you gotta see this place. It's creepy as hell," Ernie said, his voice echoing off the walls. Paulie and I followed, trying not to trip over the rubble and debris. The air inside was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and a musty odor clung to the crumbling walls. We wandered through the empty halls, joking around and trying to spook each other. But then things started getting weird. We heard footsteps that weren't ours, echoing through the factory. At first we thought it was just the building settling, but then the footsteps got louder, closer. We stopped dead in our tracks, listening. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," Paulie replied, his eyes wide. Ernie, being Ernie, decided to shout into the darkness. "Hey, who's there?" Silence. Then a low, guttural sound, like an animal growling. My stomach tightened. This wasn't funny anymore. "Let's get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But Ernie, always the brave one, wanted to investigate. He moved towards the sound, and we followed reluctantly. We turned a corner, and there it was. A massive, hulking figure covered in thick, dark fur, with eyes that glowed yellow in the darkness. It stood on two legs, but it looked more like a wolf than a man. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't some prank or urban legend. This thing was real, and it was staring right at us. Ernie, ever the idiot, decided to confront it. "Hey, what the hell are you?" The creature lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Ernie screamed, and that's when I snapped out of my shock. I grabbed a rusty pipe from the floor and swung it at the beast. It barely flinched. Paulie was already running, yelling at us to get the hell out. I managed to hit the creature again, harder this time, right on the head. It snarled and turned its attention to me. I knew I was next if I didn't move. I took off running, not looking back. I heard Ernie's screams and the sound of tearing flesh, but I couldn't stop. I just kept running until I was out of the factory and back at the truck. Paulie was already there, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking. "Where's Ernie?" he asked, his voice trembling. He's gone," I said, barely able to speak. "We need to go. Now." We sped back to town, not saying a word. The next morning I called the cops, told them about Ernie and the factory. They searched the place but found nothing. No sign of Ernie, no sign of the creature. It was like it never happened. But I knew what I saw. I knew Ernie was dead. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, heard Ernie's screams. I tried to go back to my normal life, but it wasn't the same. Polly and I stopped talking about that night. But the silence between us said everything. We both knew we saw something that night, something we couldn't explain. Then, about a month later, people started disappearing from town. First, it was a drifter no one really knew. Then a local kid who went out for a walk and never came back. The town was on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with that night at the factory. One night, I decided to go back. I needed answers, needed to know what happened to Ernie. I didn't tell Polly or anyone else. I just grabbed a flashlight, a baseball bat, and headed out. The factory looked even more menacing at night, but I had to do this. Inside, the place was dead silent. I retraced our steps, trying to find any clue, any sign of that creature. I reached the spot where we saw it, where Ernie died. There was blood on the floor, but no body. I kept moving, every shadow making my heart race. Then I heard it again, that growl. It was behind me. I turned, and there it was, standing in the doorway. The same yellow eyes, the same monstrous form. I gripped the bat tightly, knowing it was probably useless. The creature stepped towards me, and I swung the bat with all my might. It hit the beast's arm, but it didn't even flinch. It swiped at me, claws tearing through my shirt, grazing my skin. I stumbled back, trying to stay on my feet. I remembered the pipe from last time, somewhere on the floor. I backed up, feeling with my foot until I found it. The creature lunged again, and I swung the pipe, connecting with its head. This time, it staggered. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I ran, sprinting through the factory, out the door, and into the night. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, driving as fast as I could back to town. I went to the cops again, told them everything. They thought I was crazy, but they searched the factory one more time. Still nothing. No creature, no bodies. Just an old, abandoned building. People kept disappearing, though. The town was in a panic. Curfews were set, search parties organized, but no one found a thing. I knew that creature was still out there, hunting. I warned everyone I could, but most just thought I was losing it. Then one night, Polly went missing. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and left town, moved as far away as I could. I tried to forget, to move on. But the memories haunted me. Years passed, and I built a new life. But every now and then, I'd hear about a disappearance in some small town, and I'd wonder if it was the same creature, if it was still out there hunting. I never went back to Fenville. I never told anyone about that night, not really. But I still think about Ernie, about Polly, about the others, and I wonder if there's something more to that old factory, something that no one ever figured out. I live with the fear, the uncertainty. I don't know what that creature was, where it came from, or if it's still out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, just in case. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, it's what happened. And if you ever find yourself in an old abandoned place, and you hear something that doesn't quite belong, remember my story. Be careful, because sometimes the things we think are just stories, just myths, are all too real, and they might be waiting for their next victim. I never should have been here, I muttered to myself as I navigated the steep embankment, my boots slipping on the loose shale. There was a reason no one hiked this side of Ironclad Ridge, but I wasn't here for the views. My name is Wyatt Kimbrough, and being a park ranger in the untamed expanse of the Siskiyou Wilderness had never been the kind of job you walked away from because of a little discomfort. The terrain was relentless, the solitude endless, and the dangers, well, they were supposed to be familiar. Yet nothing felt familiar today. My radio had gone silent 3 hours earlier, a dead zone nestled in the belly of the dense pine forest, leaving me to rely on old-fashioned instinct and my outdated map. I was responding to an emergency call, a distressed signal from a hiker who had been lost for over 2 days. When dispatch first received it, I thought it was some kind of equipment malfunction. No one should have survived that long out here without supplies or shelter. I never anticipated what I would find. The forest was eerily quiet as I descended into the narrow valley. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig had me on edge. But it wasn't just the usual wilderness sounds. Something was off. I could feel it. There's an instinct that takes over after years of patrolling the woods. Your body knows when something's wrong, even before your brain catches up. Ahead, I spotted a clearing marked by a single tree with a split trunk. I had been through this area many times, but I'd never seen this clearing before, almost as if the land had shifted beneath itself, exposing new pathways that had long been hidden. I glanced at the coordinates in my notebook. This was where the signal had pinged, but there was no sign of the hiker. I felt my stomach churn with unease. The air here was heavier, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me with invisible hands. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, though there was no sound to betray an intruder. It was just the feeling that eyes were on me. Then I smelled it, the stench of rotting flesh. I moved toward the source, finding a body slumped against the tree. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and gaunt. But it wasn't just the decay that unnerved me. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, like something had crushed him and then tried to piece him back together. There were deep gouges in his flesh, raw and jagged, and something that looked almost like bite marks. I swallowed hard. This wasn't the work of a bear or a mountain lion. I'd seen those attacks before. This was different. It didn't make any sense. If an animal had done this, why had it left the body? Predators didn't just abandon a fresh kill. I crouched down to inspect the wounds, noting that whatever had mauled him had powerful jaws, stronger than anything native to this region. And the bites. No animal I knew had teeth that matched these impressions. They were wide and uneven, almost like someone had taken a pair of shears to him. As I turned to leave, I heard a low thump behind me, a branch snapping. I gripped my rifle, though deep down I knew it wouldn't do much good if whatever had done this decided to come after me. I scanned the tree line, searching for movement, and then I saw it. Something moving between the trees just beyond the clearing. It was fast, too fast to be human, and its shape was distorted by the dense underbrush. But there was no mistaking it. Something was out there. I pressed myself against the tree and waited, my heart hammering in my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stayed frozen, listening, watching. A flash of pale skin between the trees, No, not skin, fur. A hulking mass emerged from the shadows, just close enough for me to see it. The creature was enormous, almost bear-like in its size and bulk. But its face, God, its face was wrong. The snout was shorter than a bear's, more canine, with jagged tusks jutting out from the sides of its mouth like a wild boar. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, but its legs were too long, too twisted, and they ended in massive, clawed feet, more like an alligator's than any mammal I'd ever seen. I could barely move. The creature lumbered toward the corpse, sniffing the air with loud, snorting breaths. It paused over the body, and for a moment, I thought it might tear into the remains. Instead, it did something far worse. With a deep, rumbling snort, it lifted its head and bellowed into the sky. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, low and wet and thick with malice. I fought the urge to cover my ears as the sound racked through my bones. I watched in disbelief as the creature took hold of the dead man's body, lifting it effortlessly with its massive jaws. It slung the corpse over its shoulder like a rag doll and disappeared back into the forest. I stayed crouched against that tree for what felt like an eternity, listening to the receding sounds of its footsteps. My mind was racing. This thing, it wasn't just some unknown predator. It was smart. It knew what it was doing. I waited for hours, praying it wouldn't come back, until the sky darkened into evening. Finally, when I was sure it was safe, I radioed in. Dispatch barely heard me through the static. I told them about the body, the location, but not about the creature. Who would believe me? I stayed put until first light, when a search team finally reached my position. We combed the area together, but there was nothing left, not a body, not a scrap of clothing, not even a trace of blood. It was like the man had never existed. But I knew what I saw. The body had been real, and that creature, whatever it was real too. The search team found nothing, and they looked at me with thinly veiled suspicion, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But there were tracks in the dirt, heavy and deep, with claw marks that didn't match any species they'd ever cataloged. They didn't say anything outright, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Another ranger whispered something about me being off my meds. I didn't respond. There wasn't much left to say. Eventually they left. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I stayed by the split tree, staring into the forest for hours, waiting for some sign of movement. As I sat there, I realized something. That thing, whatever it was still out there. I might be the only one who had seen it, but I knew I wasn't crazy. The creature had left tracks, and those would be enough to get someone to listen. For now, that was all I had. But it was enough. My name is Ann Balok, and this happened to me in 2003. I've always been a simple guy, living in a quiet town in northern Montana. I worked at the local hardware store, a job I'd had since I was 22. I lived alone in a small cabin near the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it suited me just fine. Life was straightforward, and I liked it that way. One evening, I got a call from my buddy Oren Sky. He was an old friend, a guy I went fishing with, the kind of friend you could count on. Oren sounded shaken, which was unusual for him. He said his cousin, Finn, who had been staying with him, had gone missing. He asked if I could come over and help him look. It wasn't like Orrin to be rattled, so I grabbed my coat and headed out. Orrin lived a few miles out of town, closer to the woods. It was a peaceful spot, surrounded by tall pines and a small creek that ran behind his house. When I arrived, I found him pacing on the porch, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Thanks for coming," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Finn went out to check the traps this morning and hasn't come back. I've looked everywhere I could think of." "Let's start where he was last seen," I suggested. Orrin nodded, and we set off toward the woods. We walked in silence. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. I knew these woods well. They were where we hunted and fished, familiar territory. But that evening, they felt different, like the trees were holding their breath, watching us. We found Finn's traps empty and undisturbed. There was no sign of him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, we decided to head back. We hadn't found anything, and it was getting dark. Orrin was visibly upset, and I tried to reassure him. "We'll keep looking tomorrow first thing," I said. "Maybe he just got turned around and is hunkered down somewhere." The next day, we gathered a few more friends and set out at dawn. We spread out, calling Finn's name, hoping for any sign of him. Hours passed, and nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. On the third day, the sheriff got involved. He organized a larger search party, and we combed through the woods with dogs, covering every inch. Still no trace of Finn. People in town started talking, coming up with their own theories. Some said he ran off. Others whispered about wild animals. But Orrin and I knew Finn. He wouldn't just disappear. A week passed, and the search was called off. The town moved on, but Orrin and I couldn't. We spent every free moment searching, hoping for a clue. One evening, as we sat on Orrin's porch, exhausted and defeated, he turned to me. "Do you think something took him?" he asked, his eyes haunted. I didn't know how to answer. "I don't know, Orrin. But whatever it is, we're going to find out." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Finn, about the way the woods felt that day. Something wasn't right. I decided to head back out, alone. This time I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods. The night was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I walked for hours, my flashlight casting long shadows on the trees. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mix between a growl and a howl. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. I turned off my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I crouched down, trying to see through the darkness. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was large, much larger than any animal I knew. I stayed still, barely breathing, as the shadow moved closer. The moonlight caught its shape, and I saw it clearly. It was a wolf, but not like any wolf I'd seen before. It stood on two legs, its eyes glowing in the dark. It sniffed the air, and I knew it had caught my scent. I turned and ran, branches whipping against my face. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps heavy on the forest floor. I stumbled, falling hard, and rolled onto my back. The creature was looming over me, its teeth bared. I reached for my knife, but it was too late. It lunged, and I felt a searing pain as its teeth sank into my shoulder. I don't know how I managed to get away. It was a blur of pain and fear, but somehow I found myself stumbling out of the woods and onto Oren's porch. He took one look at me and rushed me inside, slamming the door behind us. "Anne, what the hell happened?" he demanded, his face pale. I couldn't speak, the pain too intense. Oren grabbed the first aid kit and did his best to patch me up. As he worked, I told him what I saw. "A werewolf, Oren. I swear it was a werewolf." He stared at me, disbelief in his eyes. That sounds crazy." "I know, but I saw it. It bit me." We sat in silence, the reality of what I said sinking in. Oren looked at my wound, then back at me. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said. "No," I insisted. "We need to find Finn." The next few days were a blur of pain and fever. Oren stayed by my side, watching over me. My wound wasn't healing right, and I could feel something changing inside me. I was scared, but I didn't say anything to Oren. I didn't want to worry him more than he already was. One night, I woke up to find Oren gone. I stumbled outside and found him standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. "Oren, what are you doing?" I called out. He turned to me, his eyes wild. "I heard something, Anne. I think it's out there." I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "You're not going in there alone." He shook me off. "I have to find Finn. I can't just sit here and do nothing." I knew he was right. We couldn't just sit around and wait for something to happen. We needed to find out what was going on once and for all. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, knives, a shotgun, anything that might help, and headed into the woods. We walked for hours, following the sounds of the forest. Every rustle, every snap of a twig put us on edge. We were jumpy, scared, but determined. Then we heard it again, that same low, guttural sound I'd heard before. We followed it, moving as quietly as we could. The sound led us to a clearing. In the center stood the creature, its back to us. It was hunched over something, and as we got closer, we saw what it was. It was Finn, or what was left of him. The sight was gruesome, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Oren let out a strangled cry, and the creature turned, its eyes locking onto us. It stood, blood dripping from its mouth, and snarled. Oren raised the shotgun and fired, the blast echoing through the trees. The creature howled in pain but didn't go down. It lunged at Oren, knocking the shotgun from his hands. I rushed forward, slashing with my knife. The blade bit into its flesh, and it turned on me, its eyes burning with rage. It swiped at me with its claws, and I felt a sharp pain as they raked across my chest. I staggered back, trying to stay on my feet. Oren grabbed the shotgun and fired again, this time hitting the creature square in the chest. It let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing to the ground. We stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body. "We did it," Oren said, his voice shaking. "We killed it." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. We looked at Finn's remains, a mix of grief and relief washing over us. We had found him, but it was too late. We buried what we could find, marking the spot with a simple cross made from branches. As we made our way back to Oren's house, we were silent, each lost in our thoughts. We knew life would never be the same. The town accepted our story of a wild animal attack, and Finn was mourned and laid to rest. But Oren and I knew the truth. We had faced something out of a nightmare and survived. Weeks passed, and my wounds slowly healed. But there was something different about me. I could feel it in the way my senses sharpened, in the way my body responded to the moonlight. I kept it to myself, not wanting to worry Oren or anyone else. One night, as I sat on my porch staring at the moon, Oren joined me. He handed me a beer, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. "Anne, do you ever think about that night?" he asked finally. "Every day," I admitted. "But we did what we had to do." He nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "Yeah, we did, but sometimes I wonder if there's more out there, if we just scratched the surface." I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that we had survived, and life went on. We were changed, scarred by what we had seen and done. But we were still here, and as long as we had each other, we could face whatever came our way. So we sat there, two friends sharing a quiet evening, the memory of that night a shadow between us. We didn't know what the future held, but we knew one thing for sure. We would face it together, no matter what. I had been a park ranger for what felt like a good chunk of my life, and in that time, I had learned how to deal with just about anything. Poachers, forest fires, even the occasional mountain lion. My name's Roy Calder, and I've always prided myself on being level-headed and practical. I grew up in a small town in Maine, the kind of place where if you didn't know how to handle a rifle by the age of 12, you weren't much of anything. My father was a logger, and I guess you could say I followed the family trade, except instead of cutting the trees down, I spent my life making sure they stayed upright. Most people think being a ranger is all sunsets and hiking, but that's not the half of it. Sure, there's the beauty, but there's also the isolation. There are miles of forest out here where a person can go missing, and it could take days, maybe weeks, to find them, if at all. And that's where my day started. A simple missing person call. A local named Greg Henning had gone for a morning hike on one of the lesser-known trails and hadn't come back by afternoon. His wife was worried, and that meant I had to go looking. It wasn't uncommon for people to get lost, but Henning wasn't some city slicker. He was a regular, knew these woods like the back of his hand. Or so I thought. I strapped on my pack, radioed in my location to dispatch, and set off into the forest. I started at the entrance of the trail, a narrow, little-used path that wound its way deep into the woods. The trees here grew thick and twisted, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. The ground beneath my boots was soft with damp leaves, the kind that swallowed up your footsteps, making the whole place feel unnervingly quiet. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of Henning, broken branches, footprints, anything that might lead me in the right direction. But the further I went, the more I felt something was off. I'm not a man who jumps at shadows, but there was a stillness in the air that didn't sit right with me. The forest was too quiet, like all the animals had decided to pack up and leave at once. It was then that I saw it, something half buried under a pile of leaves. Henning's hat, not a good sign. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I noticed the drag marks. They started just a few feet away from the hat, leading deeper into the forest, almost as if someone or something had pulled him through the underbrush. My gut clenched. No man could leave marks like these unless he was being dragged against his will. But what was doing the dragging? I followed the trail, moving quicker now, my hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife strapped to my belt. The marks led to a small clearing, and that's where I saw it. Greg Henning, or what was left of him. His body was twisted in ways that a human body shouldn't be. Arms bent backward, legs mangled. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst was his face. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, his eyes wide and empty. His chest had been torn open, ribs splayed out like the spokes of a broken umbrella. Something had done this to him, and it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. I swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that had risen in my throat. This was no animal attack. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing that belonged in these woods. But something was out here, and it was hunting. I heard a rustle behind me and spun around, knife in hand. But there was nothing there, just the wind. Or so I tried to tell myself. I knew better. I'd seen enough tracks and signs to know when I wasn't alone. Something was watching me, waiting. I turned back to Henning's body, trying to think through the panic that was starting to creep into my mind. I needed to get out of here, back to the station and call for backup. But as I took a step forward, I heard another sound, a low, wet huff, like the exhale of a massive creature. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned around. That's when I saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. But there was no mistaking it. The thing was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall and covered in coarse, matted fur. Its body was hunched, with long arms that almost dragged along the ground. Its head was oddly shaped, almost like that of a boar, with a snout that protruded forward, but longer and more grotesque. Rows of sharp, jagged teeth gleamed beneath its curled lip, and as it took a step forward, I could hear the sickening crackle of its joints, like old wood snapping under pressure. The smell hit me next, rotting flesh and wet fur. It was enough to make my eyes water. The creature took another step forward, and I could see it clearly now. Its eyes. Well, I didn't want to think about its eyes. Let's just say they didn't look like they belonged in the head of any creature I'd ever seen. Instinct took over. I bolted. I didn't care about making noise or staying quiet. All I could think about was getting away from that thing. My boots pounded against the forest floor as I ran, branches whipping against my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step. I burst through the tree line, the trail ahead in sight, and I ran for all I was worth. I didn't stop until I reached the station. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and grabbing the radio. My hand shook as I called for backup, breathless as I tried to explain what had happened. But even as I spoke, I knew there was no way they'd believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed me. It didn't take long for the sheriff and a couple of deputies to arrive, guns drawn and ready for anything. I led them back to where I'd found Henning's body. But when we got there, it was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the bloody drag marks that led deeper into the forest. Whatever had killed him had taken the body, and whatever it was still out there. The sheriff looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're sure about what you saw, Calder?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I know what I saw, Sheriff. And whatever it was, it's not something that belongs in these woods. They searched the area for hours, but there was nothing to be found. No tracks, no signs of the creature, nothing except for the bloodstains on the ground. In the end, they chalked it up to a rogue animal, probably a bear, they said. But I knew better. I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't over. A few weeks later, another hiker went missing, and then another. Each time, the same signs, drag marks, blood stains, but no bodies. They called in wildlife experts, trackers, even some hunters, but none of them could find a trace of the creature. It wasn't until a month later that the killings stopped. But I never forgot that thing. Whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere, in the woods, waiting for its next prey. My name is Rhett Callahan, and this happened to me in 2003, a year I won't forget no matter how much I try. I grew up in a small town in Wyoming, where everyone knew everyone, and you couldn't sneeze without the whole town knowing. My old man ran a hardware store, and my mom was a school teacher. I wasn't anything special. Average grades, played some football in high school, worked at the family store after graduation. I guess you could say I was just a regular guy in a regular town. I never thought I'd end up with a story worth telling, but here we are. It all started on a Friday evening. I had just finished a long shift at the store and decided to unwind with a couple of beers at Jimmy's Bar, the only watering hole in town worth mentioning. I met up with my buddy Clay and his girlfriend Marn. We shot some pool, had a few laughs, and talked about nothing in particular. It was just another night, or so I thought. Around midnight, Clay suggested we head up to the old Miller place. The Millers had moved out years ago, and the place had been abandoned ever since. It had become a local hangout spot for kids looking to get into trouble, or for folks like us who just wanted to escape the monotony of small-town life. I wasn't too keen on the idea. Something about that place always gave me the creeps, but I wasn't about to be the wet blanket. Besides, Clay was driving, and I was in no shape to argue. We piled into Clay's beat-up pickup truck and made our way out of town. The Miller place was about 10 miles out, nestled in a thick patch of woods. The road was bumpy, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. By the time we got there, the full moon was high in the sky, casting eerie shadows over the old farmhouse. As we pulled up, Marn made a joke about the place being haunted. Clay laughed, but I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. We grabbed a couple of flashlights from the truck and made our way inside. The place was in worse shape than I remembered. Broken windows, peeling wallpaper, and the unmistakable smell of mold and damp earth. We wandered around, talking about how the Millers just up and left one day, leaving everything behind. It was like they had vanished into thin air. Clay suggested we explore the basement, and against my better judgment, I followed. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder as we descended. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, rusty tools, and boxes of who knows what. Marn found an old lantern and managed to get it lit, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As we poked around, I noticed something odd. One of the walls didn't quite match the rest of the basement. It looked newer, like someone had patched it up hastily. I pointed it out to Clay, and he, being the curious idiot he was, decided to investigate. He grabbed a crowbar from a nearby shelf and started prying at the boards. After a few minutes of grunting and swearing, he managed to pull a section loose, revealing a narrow passageway. "Think we should go in?" Clay asked, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Man, I don't know," I replied. "This seems like a bad idea." "Come on, Rhett. Where's your sense of adventure?" Marnay teased. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we squeezed through the opening one by one. The passage was cramped and smelled of damp earth. We shuffled forward, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a small room. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned wooden chest. Clay, ever the fearless leader, approached the chest and tried to open it. It was locked, but that didn't deter him. He pulled out a pocket knife and started fiddling with the lock. Marn and I watched, half expecting something to jump out at us. "Got it!" Clay exclaimed as the lock clicked open. He lifted the lid, and we peered inside. The chest was filled with old papers, photographs, and various trinkets. At first glance, it looked like a bunch of junk, but as we sifted through it, we realized it was all connected to the Millers. There were family photos, letters, and even a couple of old journals. One journal, in particular, caught my eye. It belonged to Thomas Miller, the patriarch of the family. I started flipping through the pages, and my blood ran cold. The entries detailed strange occurrences, howling at night, livestock disappearing, and sightings of a large, wolf-like creature. Thomas wrote about how he had tried to protect his family, how he had barricaded the house and set traps, but nothing seemed to work. The last entry was dated the day before the Millers vanished. It simply read, "It's here. Guys, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Why? What's the rush?" Clay asked, still rummaging through the chest. "This isn't just an abandoned house. Something happened to the Millers. Something bad." Before I could explain further, we heard a noise from the tunnel. It was a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. We turned our flashlights toward the passage, but there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" Marn whispered. "Yeah, we need to leave." "Now," I insisted. We hurried back through the tunnel, our footsteps echoing off the walls. As we emerged into the basement, I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The basement door slammed shut, and we heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. "Who's there?" Clay shouted. But there was no response. We were trapped. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then we heard it again, the low, guttural sound, this time closer. "We need to find another way out," I said, trying to stay calm. We started searching the basement, looking for any other exits. Marn found a small window near the ceiling, but it was too high for us to reach. Clay grabbed a broken chair and used it to boost himself up. He managed to pry the window open and climb through, then reached down to help Marnie and me. As we scrambled out of the basement, we could hear the sound growing louder, more menacing. We didn't stick around to find out what it was. We ran to the truck and sped off, not looking back. The ride back to town was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally got back to Jimmy's bar, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Clay was convinced it was just some prank, that someone was messing with us. But I knew better. Those journal entries, the noises, the locked door, it was all too real. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I started noticing strange things, scratches on my door, dead animals in the yard, and that same low guttural sound at night. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head, but it was no use. One night, about a week after our visit to the Miller place, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the living room, I saw it, a large, wolf-like creature with glowing eyes and matted fur. It was rummaging through my things, knocking over furniture and growling softly. I froze, unsure of what to do. The creature turned and looked at me, its eyes piercing through the darkness. I knew I had to act fast. I swung the bat with all my might, but the creature dodged and lunged at me. Its claws raked across my arm, and I stumbled back, tripping over a chair. In a panic, I scrambled to my feet and ran for the front door. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footsteps echoing in my ears. I threw open the door and bolted outside, not stopping until I reached the street. I turned to see the creature standing in the doorway, watching me with those glowing eyes. I didn't go back home that night. Instead, I went to the police station and told them everything. They didn't believe me, of course. They thought I was drunk or high, but they agreed to send a patrol car to check it out. I waited at the station, my arm bandaged and my nerves shot. When the officers returned, they said they hadn't found anything unusual. No sign of a break-in, no strange creatures, nothing. They chalked it up to a wild animal or a prank. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I couldn't stay in that town after that. I packed up my things and moved to the city, hoping to leave it all behind. But even now, years later, I still hear that low, guttural sound in my nightmares. I still see those glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. Clay and Marn stayed behind, and we lost touch over the years. I heard through the grapevine that Clay got married and had kids, and Marn moved away for college. They never mentioned the Miller place again, and neither did I. Some things are better left forgotten. I tried to move on with my life, but the memory of that night never really left me. I took a job at a warehouse, met a girl named Jessie, and eventually got married. We had a couple of kids, and life went on. But every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye or hear a strange noise in the night, and I'd be reminded of that creature. One evening I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when I heard a rustling in the bushes. I tensed up, gripping the armrest of my chair. A moment later, a stray cat emerged, and I let out a sigh of relief. But then I noticed something else, a set of footprints leading away from the house, too large to be the cat's. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to find out what had happened to the Millers and why that creature had targeted me. I decided to go back to the Miller place one last time, to face whatever was haunting me. I didn't tell Jessie where I was going. I didn't want to worry her. I just grabbed my old baseball bat, got in the car, and drove out to the old farmhouse. The place was even more run down than before, overgrown with weeds and vines. The front door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I made my way to the basement, flashlight in hand. As I descended the stairs, I felt a chill run down my spine. The basement was just as we had left it, cluttered with old furniture and tools. I approached the patched-up wall, now fully exposed. The passageway was still there, dark and foreboding. I took a deep breath and squeezed through, just as we had done all those years ago. The small room with the chest was empty, the contents long gone. I shone my flashlight around, searching for any clues. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a trapdoor in the corner of the room. It was partially covered by dirt and debris, but it was there. I cleared away the debris and pried the trapdoor open. A set of wooden stairs led down into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then steeled myself and started down the stairs. The air grew colder and damper as I descended, and the sound of dripping water echoed off the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a cavernous underground chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, stained with what looked like dried blood. As I approached the altar, I heard a low growl behind me. I turned to see the creature, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It was larger than I remembered, its fur matted and covered in dirt. It bared its teeth, and I knew there was no way out. I raised the baseball bat, ready to defend myself. The creature lunged at me, and I swung with all my might. The bat connected with its head, and the creature yelped in pain. But it wasn't enough. It swiped at me with its claws, knocking me to the ground. I struggled to my feet, blood dripping from my wounds. I could feel my strength fading, but I refused to give up. I swung the bat again, this time aiming for the creature's legs. It stumbled, giving me a moment to catch my breath. But the creature recovered quickly, its eyes burning with rage. It lunged at me again, and this time I wasn't fast enough. Its claws raked across my chest, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. As I lay there bleeding and helpless, I realized this was it. This was how it would end. But then I heard a noise, a voice calling my name. It was Jessie. She had followed me, and she had brought a gun. The creature turned to face her, but she didn't hesitate. She fired a single shot, hitting the creature square in the chest. It let out a deafening howl and collapsed to the ground, dead. Jessie rushed to my side, tears streaming down her face. She called for help, and soon I was being loaded into an ambulance. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive, that the creature's claws had narrowly missed my vital organs. I spent the next few weeks in the hospital, recovering from my injuries. The police investigated the Miller place and found evidence of ritualistic sacrifices and other gruesome activities. They believed the creature had been some kind of guardian, protecting the secrets hidden in the underground chamber. As for me, I was just glad to be alive. I knew I'd never forget that night, but I also knew I couldn't let it define me. I had a family to take care of, a life to live, and as long as I had Jessie by my side, I knew I could face anything. In the end, the Miller place was demolished, and the land was left to nature. The town moved on, and so did I. But every now and then, I still hear that low growl in my nightmares, a reminder of the night I came face to face with a monster. And though I'll never fully understand what happened, I know one thing for sure: I survived, and that's enough for me.